A Moneybox investigation has found that council tenants in England and Wales on the new benefit called Universal Credit are much more likely to be in rent arrears than other tenants. We surveyed 12 big cities. Here are just two examples. Newcastle told us that about 3 in 4 tenants on Universal Credit are in arrears, compared with less than 1 in 3 on other benefits. Manchester told us the amount of arrears averaged £739 for tenants on Universal Credit, but just £266 for those on housing benefit. Everywhere we inquired, from Hull to Cardiff, Nottingham to Sheffield, the story was the same. Tenants on Universal Credit are between 2 and 3 times more likely to be in rent arrears, and those arrears are between 2 and 3 times as big. Steve lives in Hull with his wife and 4 children in a council house. He's one of more than 6,000 council tenants there, struggling to pay their rent.
It was mid-2018, my wife became ill. The illness meant that she had to not leave work but take time from work. Luckily for us, for the first 6 months she was actually fully paid by her employer. But after that 6 months we were 50% down on the income. So I said, well, why don't we try for the Universal Credit? It had just been introduced in our area. Went through all the application process, knew about the 5-week wait. But then money was such that we were in arrears because 1 month had already passed, and we're into the 5th week then, and then the arrears came around again. During the application I was offered the advance payment. I didn't accept the advance payment because I knew at the end of the day I had to pay that back. There was a good chance that my wife would be back in work after a certain amount of time. I didn't want that debt of the advance payment with us after we'd finished with the Universal Credit. I actually paid the rent on a credit card because I thought as soon as the Universal Credit came through, I could pay that credit card off and start again. I was always in the hope that my wife would be back at work and everything would be back to normal. It actually took longer than we expected. We're getting back to normal now because my wife's back at work, but with it being a year and a half down the line, we're forever chasing that payment. So we're trying to pay that a little bit more to reduce the amount.
Hull Council tenant Steve. Now, Ray Davis is head of the specialist debt team at Hull and East Riding Citizens Advice Bureau.
The initial 5-week wait for Universal Credit is the thing that tips people straight away into rent arrears, and also the amount of money that you may receive each month when you're working tends to fluctuate. Universal Credit reacts with the wages for the previous month. People genuinely don't know, and this affects working people more than non-working people, because Universal Credit is a benefit for those in work and out of work.
So are you saying that Universal Credit makes it more difficult?
Yes, I'm saying that.
Well, with us listening to that is Chloe Fletcher. She's Policy Director at the National Federation of ALMOs. That's a trade body for the organisations which manage council housing for councils. Is that experience there typical of the rest of the country?
It's very typical, yes. We've been working with colleagues across the council housing sector for a number of years, surveying our members to try to find out what the impact of the rollout of UC has been. And in 2015 we discovered that 89% of people on Universal Credit were in arrears, compared to the average across council housing sector of 33%. Thankfully that has gone down a bit. Our last survey out in April 2019 showed 67% of UC claimants were in arrears, compared to an overall average of 30%.
Yeah, so twice as bad, really. Do you confirm what Ray Davis has told us, that this is a particular problem of Universal Credit? The previous benefits which it replaced weren't as bad.
There were always issues, and people do tend to fall into arrears with the change of circumstances which necessitates a benefit claim. But there is a particular issue with Universal Credit, because you're waiting for that first payment for 5 weeks and it's all of your money, and these are generally people who don't have savings in the bank to tide them over.
But the Department for Work and Pensions tells us, they say it's misleading to say that rent arrears is directly attributed to Universal Credit, and they say tenants come with arrears, but also there was an upward trend in arrears before universal credit began.
We hadn't seen that general upward trend particularly. I mean, it was slightly up and down as you would expect. General austerity has caused, obviously, people on very low incomes to have other money worries.
And what about the advance payments? Because one of the changes the government made a while ago is that you could get up to a whole month's benefit in advance within a few days to help with these. But as Steve said to us, then you did have to pay that off after a while.
Absolutely, you have to pay that off. That causes financial difficulties because obviously our benefit system is a very minimum amount of money to live on, and then to have to find money to repay that means that they probably don't have as much money to repay those arrears. And often our members are telling us that tenants don't use that advance to pay the rent in those first 5 weeks because they have other more pressing needs.
Ray Davis.
They've got such financial pressures anyway. Certainly none of that advance is going to go towards the rent because they're already looking for money for food, gas and electricity, which often for people who are poor is by way of prepayment meters. Therefore, if you don't find money to top up your key or your card, you'll be sat in the dark.
And I suppose we should say that in Steve's case, he and his wife both worked. They weren't on benefits. She had to leave her job because of her illness. And that kind of life event, even though he carried on working, meant they had to go on benefits.
Yes, quite often in Hull. Hull is a low-wage area, and there are a lot of people in Hull who are reliant in some way on benefits, whether they be working or not.
The Department for Work and Pensions tells us that there are what they call alternative payment arrangements which allow the rent to be paid directly to the landlord. Why can't those be used more widely?
Usually that will only occur when someone's in at least 2 months' rent arrears.
So you have to get into difficulty before you can say, would you please pay it directly to the landlord?
Generally speaking, yes. There are some other conditions for vulnerable groups, but generally that is the situation. With housing benefit, the old benefit to cover rent payments, that automatically went to the local authority, who was the landlord. Whereas in UC, it goes automatically to the claimant.
Can the councils do more? I know Stoke-on-Trent, for example, is making very concerted efforts to try to solve this problem and are having some success. How are they doing that?
They are using that alternative payment arrangement, and they are making sure that they put everybody who is going into arrears or is already in arrears straight on to those alternative payment arrangements so that they are at least getting their rent paid.
What would your message be, Ray, to the government, who I'm sure will be listening because the DWP has sent us a long statement? In fact, they say universal credit's a force for good and provides a vital safety net.
We need to look at how it actually works for poor and vulnerable people. Benefit systems are often designed by people who are stable and mentally well, and it's often administered against those who are not very well, depressed or vulnerable for other reasons. And because that they've made universal credit very reactive to people's income from work, people don't genuinely know about what you see they're going to receive at the end of the month.
I want them to pay it in advance rather than in arrears because these are people on very low income with no other safety net, and then look at how they can improve the IT and the policies behind that IT system so that it properly supports people in low paid work.
Chloe Fletcher and Ray Davis, and they were talking about the situation in England and Wales. In Northern Ireland, universal credit is paid twice a month and rent is automatically paid direct to the landlord. In Scotland, people can choose both those options.